Well, good evening, everybody in the MB Poli world. I am in the Poli Pod world, sorry. I'm here by myself for now, but that will not last. Joanna is just putting the little one to bed. So we're going to be both on the pod eventually, but for now, I'm here in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoq, and the Pasquotanquetty in Manisquest, or St. John. And it's another week, and we've had some interesting things going on. Of course, if you were listening to the last podcast, you would remember us talking about how the Liberals really need to open up some acts, and we gave them a list of 3 or 4 acts that seemed to be a timely piece of legislative reform that's needed because of how out of date they are and the changes that are, we're undergoing in society. And they did open up some acts. So they're opening up the Health Act and they're opening up the Clean Air Act. So not the ones we recommended to the same extent. You could make good arguments for the Healthcare Act and everything that's in line with that. But at the end of the day, we have to eat our words a little bit, I guess, because, governing is difficult. And the most difficult challenge of any government is legislative reform, policy, program, even in some cases. But those are all really important. So this week, we've got some interesting election news in Canada. We have got an election in Newfoundland that I want to spend a little bit of time speaking about to everybody. Thank you to all of our podcast supporters who listen every week, who donate to us on Patreon, and who help us make this program, possible, helps make everything possible. And, one of the most interesting things, Newfoundland. You wouldn't think, we haven't talked much about Newfoundland on this podcast, the odd time. We did do, of course, a couple podcasts around our time to Grossmore National Park last year. If those of you who watch this podcast frequently would remember, Joanna and I and a team from St. John, as well as St. Martin's here in New Brunswick, actually, both of us, were selected as a community to go to the Grossmore Institute of Sustainable Tourism. What are you guys doing with sustainable tourism, you ask? Well, it actually had far more to do with community development, asset-based community-led development, community-led based tourism, and what does tourism look like from the aspect and from the lens of those who actually live there, less commercialized, focusing on the grassroots of the authentic parts of the community, living within those boundaries, all of that. It was very interesting. So we ended up going to Grossmore, and we ended up getting pretty involved with some of the Newfoundland folks over there about what their politics are. We made some comments on them and all that. You probably can hear Beatrix in the background. That is just one reason why Joe's not here at the moment. I put her to bed, but she normally doesn't wake up. But tonight, she is woken up. So I'm still here in my work clothes. And I wanted to do a pod that focused on, one, the Maritime Union. We have to talk about it. I'm convinced it's a great time to talk about it. And from there, we're going to get to the Atlantic perspective. We're going to start with Newfoundland, and Joe's going to bring us some stuff that we want to talk about and touch on a little later. Let's get to the Newfoundland election. Why are we covering that on the MB Polypod? Because, listeners, I know we want to think very highly of ourselves in New Brunswick as much as we can. We're proud people. But we're the size of Mississauga, right? We're a very small section. And more when we see the drumbeat of change politically, powers of control, influence, we're kind of in the last days, in the last breaths, I would say, of oversized Atlantic influence on Confederation. I haven't really talked about that very much, but I've been thinking about it a lot in the last few weeks as we consider these changes and shifts that are happening across the country, where you see where you see British Columbia, Premier Eby, Danielle Smith in Alberta, Premier Ford, to some extent Legault right now in Quebec, Wab Canoe even. You're seeing a lot of really dynamic shifts in the political landscape of the country. Obviously, you could say Stephen Harper was what he said, the West is in, right? When Stephen Harper became prime minister after the reconfiguration of the Conservative Party, we had a realignment that considered more of a Western influence, let's say. But even that, there was still, have been, and continues to be, pretty outsized amounts of influence on the government, the federal government that is, by Atlantic Canada. Between cabinet ministers, high-profile cabinet ministers, like Dom LeBlanc, and you could say, Wayne Long here in New Brunswick as well. There's been other ones. Recently, we have, there's been a number, and I'm just blanking on Sean's last name, but anyway, cabinet ministers that hold this level of influence over federal government. And the writing seems to be on the wall for it. And I think it's more important than ever for us as Atlantic Canadians to come to grips with that. We've assumed a lot of voice. We have an outsized representation in the House of Commons for sure, but also in the Senate by a lot. Alberta and BC and British Columbia, BC and Manitoba would love to have the level of influence that Atlantic Canada enjoys by default, because we're part of the founding provinces of the Confederation, right? New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Lower Canada, Upper Canada, Ontario, Quebec. That was it in Charlottetown. And so I think it's more important than ever for us to care about what's happening around us, because it's my position, and that's why I wanted to do a little bit of a longer take this to start the pod, that the best thing we could do as Atlantic Canadians would be to join under an Atlantic banner, Atlantic flag, province, a realignment, so that we can capture the level of influence we currently have, position ourselves with a lot of efficiency gains, bureaucratically for sure, but governmentally as well, from governance as well, that we can capitalize on those efficiencies. And we can compete at scale with Alberta, BC. When you look at Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, you put us in the bucket. We're over 2 million people. We have multiple ports, multiple cities. We can speak as a unified voice of the Eastern Seaboard, which Ontario and Quebec must respect. But right now, we often get played off each other. I can tell you a lot about what my ideal arrangement would be, but I do think this is a conversation that I would love to see serious political people, serious commentators, serious folks discuss. So before we get into what a Maritime Union or Atlantic Union could look like, let's talk about the pod. The election. Joe's just coming in here now. Let's talk about the election in Newfoundland, and paying attention to this, getting informed about this will help us in our conversations. Anyway, so Newfoundland, paying attention to that election, it's a good time to do it. But what I found fascinating about this election, and it's why I wanted to bring it up in this pod, it's probably one of the only single issue elections that you really could reduce everything down to a single issue that I've seen in a very long time of keeping up with politics, following provincial, municipal, federal politics. And that is this energy deal with Quebec Hydro. So to give you a little background, we know the result, right? We have a new designated premier. The current, obviously, premier is John Hogan, taking over for Andrew Furey, Liberal leader of the Liberals in Newfoundland. And now Tony Wakeham, PC leader, has come to power with a majority government in Newfoundland. You wouldn't know unless you were really following along how much of an upset that was, how much of an underdog story that was. And to give you an idea, we're going to go to our good friends, the RIT podcast. This pod was published, sorry, not just the pod, he has a whole Substack that he does, the weekly RIT, numbers pod, the every election. There's all kinds of stuff that our friend Eric Grenier at the RIT podcast does. We've talked about him a bunch. He wrote this on October 13th. Now, he laid out the fact that there, was an election coming up. Look at the polls, finally published during the campaign, trying to make some sense of them, as well as a seat projection using the data at hand. He took the province's bellwether seats and he looked at it, and what he came up with a few days before the election is that we were going to see a Liberal majority. So, interesting, right? Now, our friends at Canada 338. Now, let's scroll down to his seat projection. It wasn't a massive majority, but it was 22 Liberals, 13 Conservatives, 3 NDP, and 2 Independents. So, he had the Liberals really competitive in most of rural Newfoundland and, taking the city for sure, the St. John's area. But yeah, there was some interesting pieces to that. Now, let's go over to Canada 338. Canada 338, this is our friend Philip Fournier. Love polls, all this stuff, but it's rare that polls are off by this much. And there's a reason for that, and we want to talk about them. Between August 19th and Election Day, there were 4 polls done. Okay? You had Narrative Research, which, let's be honest, Narrative Research is Atlantic Canada's best that we have to offer around a polling firm. The problem is they did this poll in August, quite a long way before the campaign, and they published it during the campaign. So you have, here, on this podcast, I was listening, and I just happened to stumble upon it this week. You have this entire poll that is 2 months out of date, 2 months before a campaign actually took place, almost when the poll was done. And of course, Philip does rank the polls. He ranks the pollsters who do the work. Narrative consistently gets a B- C. They don't do that well. And you can kind of see why. With a 350-person sample set, 2 months before the election, releasing it in the election, it does have an effect. And it's a real credibility challenge if it's wrong, right? And they had Liberals ahead by 28 points. Compare that to MQO research in October, on October 6th, during the campaign. 541 samples, Liberals at 43, with a 3-point lead over the Conservatives at 40 PCs. Cardinal research, 49-41, Liberals ahead by 8 points. Main Street research, 1,100 samples, 52 Liberals, 32 Conservatives, Liberals plus 20. Forum research was the final one. It came in on the 10th of October. It got an A-. It had 1,100 samples. It had the Liberals at a plus 10 lead, 47-37. That's a rout, right? When you think of a 10-point lead in almost any region of the province, or sorry, of the country, provincially speaking, you look at that and you think, there's no way. They can't all be that wrong. Well, they were, because the election result was 44 PC, 43 Liberal, 8.3 NDP. So the NDP underperforming most, the PCs steeply overperforming, and the Liberals underperforming steeply. So again, though, I think there's something to be said about how the polls do in Atlantic Canada, how they miss a rural Canadian. Those of us that actually participate in polls, I think on aggregate, nationwide, it does a pretty good job. And I think the polls show us time and time again that they really give us a lot of insight and accuracy around what the election result will be. But in the Atlantic regions, we just don't see that. We don't have the volume of pollsters. And when you look at where MQO and Cardinal and Main Street and Forum, these are not Atlantic Canadian based. The best we have is Narrative. It's an Atlantic Canadian based private polling firm, research firm. And they just weren't up to the task. Now, there's not a lot of money in it in Atlantic Canada. We have so few people. Not a lot of news organizations are trying to pick you up and take your, get the data, get the information, further broadcast. It's not like Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal and these other places in the country where there's millions of people tuning in, and there's far more money for advertising and for journalism and things like that. So I just think that's the story on Atlantic Canadian polls. That's why this is off. But what I loved about this entire thing was tuning in to a local, and you guys got to check it out. It's a local podcast called On Open Line with Patty Daly. Listening to that pod on Thursday, October 16th, today's pod, it was interesting because Patty Daly is not just a run-of-the-mill sort of commentator, offhand. Is not like me. Let's put my hand up. He has an incredible intellect, knowledge set. He's a lot of memory. He brings in people on the line, but like on his open phone lines, sort of like a talk show would. But he also does his own commentary, brings interesting guests on. So I had the opportunity to watch Open Line with Patty Daly on one of the local news channels when I was staying at a hotel in Newfoundland just last year. It was really interesting to listen, and I wish New Brunswick had something like this. I'd be happy to do it. I know other people would be happy to do it too, I'm sure. But I think it's overdue. We need it. And when you listen to the people calling in, talking and commenting about this deal with Quebec Hydro and what was riding on it and how, it is making national news right now. There's commentators saying this poses serious problems for the government in Quebec because the former Liberal government and Francois Legault's government, CAQ, in Quebec, basically negotiated an MOU that was going to undo a perceived wrong from the 60s when Churchill Falls was developed, this massive hydroelectric dam that's in Labrador that feeds into Quebec, that's Quebec Hydro put the money up for, and Newfoundland and Labrador got what they perceived to be a bad deal. And when you listen to people talk about it on this, yeah, it's 60 years ago, but it's still fresh. And of course, now there's new opportunities. One massive opportunity is Gull Island in Labrador. And like these are hydroelectric dams of world scale and class. They produce a ton of energy. And of course, they're renewable. And of course, they are clean. And the biggest difficulty is transmission. But with Churchill Falls built out and producing for decades now, there's some expertise here in Quebec Hydro to do this kind of job. And so they negotiated a new deal, and they had an MOU signed, and John Hogan, who took over from Andrew Furey for the Liberals, ran on it. And Andrew Wakeham ran to pause it. Tory Wakeham chose to pause it, questioned it, said they wanted a third-party review. But what I found really interesting was listening to the average Newfoundlander talk about this. A lot of competency on the issue, a lot of understanding of nuance, not just, oh, we got a bad deal, we can't give it away, and this, that, and something else. There was a little bit of that. But there was some intellectual, posturing by the callers who did very much sound like average people around the issue, what the business case was, what the political implications are, how it fits in the rest of the world. Anyway, I have to say I was a little bit envious tuning in and watching this Newfoundland election because this has some major national level implications, and it's amazing to see an Atlantic province hit like that. Whether or not Tony Wakeham and his new PC party majority is going to cancel that, get a better deal. Who knows what their posture is going to be. But one thing's for sure, with the Quebec election around the corner, this deal now on the line, and you've got this rearrangement happening federally around national projects of interest and whatnot. Gull Island, of course, being brought up many times. It puts Newfoundland in a really interesting position that I don't think Nova Scotia's in. I know New Brunswick's not in, and PEI certainly isn't in. And anyway, that leads us to our next topic: Maritime Atlantic Union. Let's talk about it. Joe's back with us. So
Yes.
Sorry to everybody for this long
Scattered.
Brent-only rant for the last 20 minutes.
I heard it was about Newfoundland. I was putting the baby to bed, who's not a very happy camper.
I know.
However, I'm here in my Maritime's finest right now
Yeah.
to discuss the Maritime Union.
Well, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on what do you remember about Newfoundland, and are you surprised by a massive upset for the PC government over
No.
John Hogan's Liberals?
Not after our visit there last year. I feel like there were some candidates and folks who would have been embedded based on their community work in the region we were specifically in around Gross Morin. But it sounded like there was a lot of sentiment there that that change was coming, from what I understood, and that they've been, with these Liberal folks for a long time, and they needed to see a change. But as we all know, two wings the same bird. We talked about this for a long time. So
We certainly could. They did take the Gross Morin area.
they did.
They did, the PCs, yeah.
Wow.
So they flipped it. The Liberals were expected to win by a lot. They lost by not a lot by the popular vote, but they lost all their rural seats.
Right.
So
Wow.
the PC's got a majority government, and now they're going to rip up a deal with Quebec Hydro, potentially, at least review it for this massive national project on Gull Island.
That has some deja vu qualities to it.
Has some, doesn't it? So now, Maritime Union.
Yes, Maritime Union. It's come up a couple times here in this household. And I think we discussed it really early on. Like, I can't believe this podcast is going to be 3 years old in March. Like,
It's true.
it's, that's wild. So, like, this was something that's been around for, decades, really, in terms of how people often ponder the efficiency and the cost effectiveness and the sustainability of such a small population having so many provinces, when you just have to look one province over in terms of New Brunswick and see, what's the population of Quebec?
Like 9 or 8 million or something like that.
Right.
6 to 8 million. Hold on a second.
And we're here
Have to look it up.
we're here with our 2 million-ish I think with Halifax growing, we'll probably top that 2 million here, not too far distant future.
We got a couple
How many?
100,000. There we go. Yeah. So you've
I'm
got
talking Newfoundland too.
you got about 500,000 between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and PEI, and then you've got about almost 2 million between New Brunswick and
Yeah.
Nova Scotia. So you've got over 2 million.
Right. So in a landmass that's definitely more diverse and displaced, but some would argue that
8 million in Quebec. 8,500,000.
right in the Maritimes, including Newfoundland. Yeah, right.
Maybe a little closer to 2.5.
So yes, geography-wise, a little disjointed, but rural Quebec and Montreal would be also very different. And I know there's like places that are primarily French, places that are have some more Anglophone folks there. So it's every region, province is diverse in its own way. So the fact that we have 4 essentially east of Quebec, to me, has always seemed like not efficient enough, and that it's born of something that was built in the 17 and 1800s.
Definitely. We can't argue with anything there. I guess I wonder who is out there that thinks this is a good arrangement. Like who is person making the case for not changing this? Because I think what we wanted to do was build the case for the change. We've talked about it. I mean, I brought a motion to council, really stating New Brunswick is overgoverned and underperforming on all fronts.
That was a recommendation at FCM, I think.
That was a recommendation that
You
the FCM didn't make the
no,
recommendation.
you wanted to make it to them.
Yeah, I wanted to take what we were learning from FCM around ratios and representation and bring it back here. Because there's got to be a good reason to have very small ratios of representation, right? And one of the cases I made at the top of the hour was Atlantic Canada has an oversized amount of influence on the Confederation, on the rest of the country. When you think about cabinet roles, when you think about vote interest, when you think about governing parties,
Senators.
way more senators, for what it's worth, I guess. And I just look at that and I think, you listen to these other pods and you listen to these folks who are bureaucrats, consultants, with these other with you got to see a pen there. With these other hats that they wear, and they're there with their premier, and that premier represents Alberta, and Alberta has 5 million people, and now they're here with Susan Holt, and this premier in Alberta is given similar airtime and similar voice as Premier Holt or Houston.
I'd go with the PEI guy.
Sure, King, and now Wakefield, or not Wakefield. God, what am I? Wakeham. Sorry, they're the size, like their provinces are the size of one of the cities in Ontario.
I think they would call this right sizing.
Yeah, and it's just like, what is the case for keeping it this way? Because it seems like if we're going to try to hold on to what we have, as far as influence, perspective, which I think is valuable, we're Canada's oldest, most earliest settled, from a Western context, place. We have an entire different arrangement with Indigenous nations here that has informed a lot of national conversation, or seems to have. Obviously, BC, another element to that. So you're like, how do you capitalize on that for the next 100 years? And at the rate we're going, you're seeing people like Eby and Doug Ford and even Wab Kinew take a lot of that spotlight. And to me, it's like the time now is never been a more important time to consider this for a Maritime Union than now, with that in mind. And it would be a great foil to the Western separationists and the Western frustration and the infighting between BC and Alberta to see a bunch of maritime provinces coming together to say, Halifax is the capital, New Brunswick has this role now, Newfoundland has this role. Well, I don't know, what do you think? Like,
let's acknowledge it. Like, let's acknowledge the reality. And I think that's where we were at last evening in this discussion was, let's just be real with who we are. So New Brunswick, we've said this so many times, has always tried to be world class and compete with forces that are just so beyond itself. And I've always thought like there's other roles to play in this quote unquote ecosystem, right? We don't have to be the leaders and things. We can play a supportive role. And so acknowledging that that's what we are and who we are, to say the Halifax, central force. We've always been mad that Fredericton was the capital of Fredericton, like that.
Or
New Brunswick, that never should have happened. That was some, bygone threat that never actually was realized, and they never came to our shores to bomb us, and
That's
we're
right,
all
St.
fine.
John's.
So, and there's this long-standing lore, I guess, where St. John and Halifax essentially decided at the same time, we want to grow, and they both took very different approaches. And Halifax's has
paid off.
One.
Yeah, the expertise, and I think we also just went to Halifax.
Yeah.
The level of expertise that is in Halifax is surprising. The conferences that attract people to it, night and day, different than what Moncton would bring, St. John or Fredericton or Charlottetown or St. John's. Like, we're not here to just lift up Nova Scotia, but I think we got to be honest. Trying to play the game that New Brunswick's playing, and the PEI and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, where you have the population of a city across this massive landmass, and you've duplicated the energy agencies. You've duplicated the healthcare agencies, not duplicated, quadruplicated. You've got one in PEI, you've got one in Nova Scotia, you've got one in Newfoundland, you've got one in New Brunswick.
You know the one area where we've been successful? No. Yes.
Gambling.
The Atlantic Lottery Corporation is the most well thought out thing, honestly, that has brought every single province together under its gambling regulations.
Oh wow, gambulations. Never considered that word before now. But that is a good, it is late. And we both worked all day.
Yes.
Anyway.
And we have a toddler. But anyways,
Sure do.
So they figured that out. I don't see why we can do that around the liquor, the cannabis, health will be a huge one. Even here in New Brunswick, there's two.
God, yeah.
There's a French and English health authority. So listen, there'd be a long way to go in that one. So gambling was the low-hanging fruit. What would the next one be to you that we could do?
Post-secondary. Post-secondary, easy, right? Like, what are the big differences, right? Like,
Nova Scotia and PEI, I believe, are both the NSCC, like Nova Scotia.
Yeah, so PEI and Nova Scotia are a little more joined on this. They're a little further.
Same area code.
Yeah, but why in God's name? Why would New Brunswick have its own? Or we already don't have our own agricultural college, but why would we have our own trades college?
Right.
They're just so. Let's zero in on something.
What would be something next after gambling to unionize?
I don't think you do it that way. I don't think you stop gate it like that. I don't think you say, what's the next department to collaborate? You say, we're going for it or we're not.
Right.
Like, sure, maybe there's low-hanging fruit in, different healthcare services or like oversight bodies or regulatory bodies like fisheries or, DNR or DTI or something like that. But I don't think trying to piecemeal department by department would ever work.
Provinces.
Yeah, no, you'd have to say, we're all in it, we all want to get there, here's a 2-year runway, we're going to join the departments, there's a 45-day competition to see whatever department can come up with the best strategy to join these, and whoever gets it gets, some extra funding for their initiatives, and that's it.
And ultimately the bureaucracies would be depleted in each of these.
Yeah, well, you would all of a sudden have what's reasonable amount of saturation levels.
Yes.
For bureaucrats to do work. It's not reasonable to have an entire department. So you can say, well, what's an entire department? I don't know. So these departments range, but like, how many more people would it take to do DTI's work, for example, the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, across Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and PEI? How much synergy would there potentially be? Because now you've got Amherst and Sackville, which would normally have two completely different bodies that have to have provincial garages near there to equip the snowplows.
Right.
You've got now one brick and mortar facility, whatever one can be scaled up. That's just one example. But you know what I mean, right?
The infrastructure alone could be
major city. Like, do we need to have some building that houses some ministry of fisheries in New Brunswick, or could it just be one in the Maritimes?
We built a lot of infrastructure around bureaucracy.
Oh my Lord, it's insane.
Yes.
This is the point, I think, for a Maritime Union. It's just like, why do we think it's better this way?
But you know what's funny is we have criticized the Conservatives for centralization many times.
But this is regionalization, which I think is different than federal overlap, than federal vacuuming up of responsibility and, federal meddling in provincial stuff. I think what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we're now a new province, and look at this map. Like, I just brought up a bit of a regional map. Go and look at your own map. Sorry, folks, I can't put it up on the screen here. But like, look at New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland. Okay, now when you include Labrador, we're huge. Because Labrador is quite large, of course.
But not that huge.
But my gosh, we're there. I don't know if we'd be bigger than Manitoba.
Like the crust.
Right, we're like 2.5 million. Alberta's is 5 million.
Yes, right.
So all of a sudden, you've got the Eastern Seaboard united. We all are on the same page when it comes to what our shipping realities are.
Yes, I thought about that.
Logistics,
the
businesses.
European thing. And I do think that there is a case to be made for post-Gilead America, where, you know, the Eastern Seaboard becomes a place that we are delivering things to once again. But competition. We have Montreal as a port and a logistics center that it serves an ungodly amount of people. Like, how do we compete with that?
Yeah, but they can't go up the Gulf of St. Lawrence fully loaded. So Montreal is only able to be the competition feature that it is to the Atlantic region because it is so well developed.
Right.
And it's worth it for shipping containers to go up half loaded.
But we're like a toddler port.
Exactly. New Brunswick is.
Yes.
But now if you start to say, if you said in the next 15 years, Halifax Port is building ships and moving these things, St. John is doing this, St. John's is doing that. And you start to have a bit more of a focused approach to what these ports are going to be rather than Halifax is going to gobble up every ounce of business in every area that it can, any way possible, even if it doesn't make sense.
And it's going to compete against St. John's and St. John.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or Beldoon.
But who's going to lead that?
This is the question for the audience, I think. Like, does anybody even care? Because I don't think there's a way we solve the problems that we have. And let's be clear. And no Atlantic province, Nova Scotia included, could function without equalization payments.
Yes.
Like you think your hospitals have closed now? You think you have a doctor shortage now? Say goodbye to half your healthcare and a quarter of your education system.
This, I think, requires
this is an unsustainable model. We have more representation than anywhere else on the planet, possibly. I don't know. It seems that way.
It feels that
way.
It
feels that way when you talk to people. When you look at compared as like Canada's 40 million people, we're comparing the level of saturation of government officials, elected officials, in New Brunswick, 800,000, in a 40 million person population. Like, that's pretty small potatoes. And if we feel it at this level, God, I mean, what other country would?
Well, I imagine like the other provinces, if they fully grasped this reality, would feel very underrepresented.
They do, of course. There's all that tension, right? There's a lot of animosity from.
Yeah, no, and that's so you mentioned we have had this should be called Club Chaos episode. Earlier you mentioned Nitty's, who was on the podcast before. Nitty's,
one of our former guests, that's right.
Is it on TikTok, also has their own podcast called the See You Next Tuesday Effect. Super good podcast. And Nitty's gone into the depths of the Dominion Institute and of our original National Energy Board deal that Pierre Trudeau tried to make with the country, basically to say, like, we're gonna give Canadians the best energy deal first. And listen, you can go for a deep dive onto Nitty's podcast for this whole story. But this abridged version is for the NB Polypod viewers. In the 70s, we were on the same track as Norway to nationalize our energy. And Pierre Trudeau decided and pitched that Canadians should get the lowest price. And then everything after that would be market value, sell to the US, sell to Europe, whoever you want to sell to. Preston Manning and his father, the long-standing premier of Alberta from 43 to, I think it was the 60s, late 60s, formed this plan basically along with many others to disenfranchise Alberta in the grand scheme of things when it came to, you know, how they were considered nationally. It was a whole effort to pit the East against the West, to say, you know, we're funding you guys, you are living off our, you know, spoils, and we're not getting enough out of this deal. And there's all kinds of like oil interests involved. And essentially they ended up privatizing and giving away a lot of the interests that we could have, as a country, held on to ourselves.
Yeah, they built their own sovereign wealth fund. We didn't get a national sovereign wealth fund to the same extent.
So Norway now has $2 trillion in assets, while the Canadian government has
nowhere near
investors.
That compared to the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. It's the biggest in the world.
Yeah.
Bigger in the United States to try to play catch up with it.
But this is where the fork in the road occurred. And, you know, we talked about this on the podcast here about the housing fork in the 90s, where the government essentially decided to de-invest in housing. So we gave away our energy assets to a bunch of U.S. actors, essentially, and some Canadian
Ground Corps,
Yep.
things like that. Yeah.
which then were essentially once Harper came along,
Partitioned off.
And Harper was very well connected with the Manning. The Manning thing is wild.
Institute's wild.
Yeah,
It's true, but this is the thing: is like those are institutes you've heard of. They have agency on our federal conversation. Tell me a maritime one that does. You won't find one.
there's no
And
Fraser
this
Institute.
is what I mean. Is like the Fraser Institute.
Yeah.
Like we cannot get to a level of expertise for transformation in our current arrangement. So, I mean, let's sign the podcast off there. I think that's a good kind of segue to say, look, this is what we're up against. You've got this influence coming from the West. We can see where it comes from. It's not genuine. It always serves an Albertan politician well to be at odds with Ottawa.
Absolutely, and us.
You can win on that. You can't win it on that in here. Being oppositional to Ottawa, I don't think gives you the same result in New Brunswick.
We've often said as New Brunswickers, we're always having the opposite government to the one in power in Ottawa.
Ontario does too.
There's been a
they all
blue,
do.
red.
It's a Canadian thing more
Yeah.
than it is a New Brunswick thing. I understand what you're saying.
But listen, Newfoundland just did this.
Yeah.
They just went against the feds, right?
But in this case, this was the Liberals working for their third term.
Ooh, which we know is
Doesn't
a notorious
happen.
curse.
Doesn't happen very often. I mean, unless you're Mark Carney and you pull off a rabbit, like pull a rabbit out of your hat.
Well, he seems like a bit of a magician.
Anyway, that is we gotta hear from you guys on this. Does anybody know anybody? The last time somebody talked about this was 2024, and that was on the Wikipedia article
Oh,
where they
someone
updated
cares.
what the population would have been then for the maritime provinces. So when we include Atlantic Canada, which I think we should, although I think Newfoundland would be the hardest sell. They don't like maritime.
They're the last ones to join.
Yeah, they will be the last ones to join, just like they were with Canada.
Exactly.
Anyway, let us know what you think. If you're a contrarian and you want to get on here and tell us where the hell to go on this idea and 95 reasons why it's wrong, God, we'd love that.
Chaos episode.
It'd be great.
I'm pretty sure my mic died too while I was talking, so
No,
hopefully yours picked me up.
Jesus, mine's still on. Okay. All right, guys. See you next week.